Hi again. Today I'm going to review a documentary movie called Unseen, Unheard, Unafraid, and it is the history of the Federal Air Marshals. The title is the English translation of the motto of the Air Marshal Service, and the documentary was written by David Londo, who is involved. He was, or possibly still is, a serving Air Marshal, but he's involved in the Air Marshal network, their council of members. And it's produced by Sonia Hightower, who also was an Air Marshal. It's mainly concerned with the history, and so really it starts with in the 60s with the spate of hijackings of aircraft from the United States to Cuba. Cuba was off limits to US civil carriers, and people wanting to get to Cuba, whether they were Cuban nationals or sometimes just your crazies, would hijack aircraft. The security at that time at airports was non-existent. It was just like taking a bus or a train. So smuggling firearms or edge weapons or explosives on board was quite easy. And this became a real problem, so much so that in 1961 President Kennedy announced that he was placing border guard personnel on flights, and also called for upgrades to the cockpit doors, locks, etc. In the event, the Border Patrol dropped the ball. They couldn't do it, and it fell to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, whose remit was safety, both mechanical and regularity of federal aviation regulations. So they stood up a force of what they called FAA peace officers. And in the first class was a gentleman called Joseph Pontecorvo, who was an FAA inspector at the time. And they were taken to Texas, put through several weeks of training, firearms, unarmed combat, tactics, etc., and then deployed. And they flew domestically on selected flights. And the documentary highlights one particular hijacking, which was the first fatality of an American citizen on a flight. And the flight attendant is on the film relating the events, and it was rather amazing that the captain, even though the co-pilot had been incapacitated, the captain had bullet wounds in both arms and managed to land the aircraft at Logan Airport, Boston. That was going to be a suicide flight. The hijacker didn't have a destination. He just wanted them to fly over the Atlantic until fuel ran out. Then in the 70s, the nature of hijacking changed, and it involved international terrorism, particularly from the Middle East. And Europe and other countries were plagued by hijackings and attacks at airports. So a program which covered increased security procedures on the ground at the boarding process, and then they also looked at the air marshals, and by this time there were only 12 FAA peace officers, and their focus was on the domestic flights. So it was decided to stand up a force comprised of experienced law enforcement personnel from both the United States Customs Service and the US Marshals Service. And these were taken to Fort Belvoir to attend what was called the Treasury Aviation Security Officer School, or TASOS. And once they graduated from this, and again it was quite an intense program covering 4 weeks, they were deployed, and they tended to cover particular airlines. They were assigned to an airline rather than a geographical location. And if they were on an aircraft such as a Boeing 707 or a DC-8, there would be 2 marshals. They were called sky marshals, by the way. And if it was something like a 747 with an upper deck, there would be 3 marshals, 2 on the upper deck, which had access to the flight deck, and 1 in the main cabin. And I have talked about this in a book I reviewed by one of the chaps who was in that program. He's actually on the documentary. So if you're more interested in how they operated, which was a totally different way to modern times, then have a look at the book. So, as happens in many spheres, over time the program tapered off, and then the next phase was a result of the hijacking of TWA 847 by Islamic terrorists, and in which an American naval personnel was murdered. And President Reagan had a decree in which he wanted flights to be protected, and so the Federal Air Marshal program was stood up again under the FAA, and it was administered by the Civil Aviation Security Office, and so members were classified as civil aviation security specialists, and they had a dual role. They worked on the ground from an office co-located near an airport, and they would enforce federal aviation regulations on the airlines and the airport services. But then they would be brought together with personnel from other field officers to a central location and deployed overseas for up to 3 weeks, hubbing out of a location in the Far East or the Middle East, and protecting US carriers over there. And it was intelligence-based missions. The training was at Marana, which was a satellite facility of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Their main base was at Glencoe in Georgia, but they had established this out near Tucson at an air park. There was lots of aircraft, and they had a range, etc., over there. And the video interviews one gentleman who was recruited during this time, and he talks about his experiences. This, being an FAA program, was heavily involved in the aviation community, and they would send personnel over to be briefed on significant events in friendly countries, how they had coped with terrorism, certain famous incidents such as the Air France hijacking at Marseille, etc., and come back with the material to disseminate and to learn from. In 1992, there was a revision of the program, and no longer would the personnel have a dual role. They decided to slim it down to a dedicated cadre who would only work as air marshals. They wouldn't do the regulatory mission at all. And they would be located in one area, train together and deploy almost exclusively internationally, again based on intelligence. And this involved what was called a skills upgrade program. And one of the things that happened was the firearms training became very, very intensive, and an expert called Tom Bullen was brought in. Now, Tom Bullen had been a US Marine, and he had been the senior instructor in the HRP, the High Risk Personnel Program, which was presented at Quantico. And a friend of mine who had been an Air Marshal, a colleague of Marcus's, who was now an instructor at FLETC, a firearms instructor at Glencoe, together with a colleague, were sent to audit the HRP by fully taking part in it, to the point where they both passed out as the two top shooters on the program. But it covered more than just shooting. It covered tactics and personal security, because it was aimed at US Marine personnel deployed in hostile areas such as the Middle East or Central South America. It was a very, very good program, and they brought back quite a few good ideas to incorporate into the training at FLETC. So Tom Bullen is interviewed in the documentary, and he you see some of the firearms training and the drills that he introduced. Primarily, he's responsible for creating what was called the Tactical Pistol Course, the TPC, which became the sort of benchmark for the Air Marshals. It was a very intense shooting program. Didn't require a great deal of ammunition, but it required a lot of concentration, because the time limits were very, very tight, and the accuracy requirements likewise very, very demanding. And the personnel had to perform the drill using the issued equipment, which went from being a SIG 228. Later on it became a 229 in 357 SIG, which is not an easy pistol to shoot. And they had to do it from underneath a cover garment, just as they would be on the jet. So the TPC actually became kind of the gateway into the program. And it was presented in a very demanding way. They did it individually in front of the class, so there was peer pressure, and they knew that if they failed, they were out of a job, or they were off flight status anyway. So it really was a pressure test. So the skills upgrade program and the single mission led to an establishment of 36 personnel split into 3 teams, and they had 3 phases of the employment. One team would be deployed, flying on international missions based on intelligence. Another team would be training, either at the home base or sent out to various locations, working on airport procedures or any aspect of the mission that they might need. And the third team would be on a standby status. And the group was highly professional, highly motivated. They studied aviation in all aspects, how airports worked, how the equipment was used on the ground, how passengers move through the airport, choke points and so on, flight procedures, the whole international aspect of what the threat matrix was. Training at this phase, it also included working with some very prestigious groups, including Delta Force. And ultimately, it was decided to do an evaluation by an outside agency, and Delta Force were asked to do it. They came down and they observed and monitored the firearms training and the drills, and came to the conclusion that the Air Marshals were among 1% of the best shooters in the world. So it was quite an accolade from guys who were top professionals themselves. So that was the program right up to 9/11. And actually, on the day of the hijacks, there were actually only 33 out of the required 36 Air Marshals still available. Obviously, after 9/11, everything changed, and the documentary doesn't really go into anything after 9/11 for reasons of security classification by the people who were involved in producing and writing it. They were still subject to their Air Marshal regulations. However, it is known that the focus became much more on the domestic, as well as still covering international, and obviously the numbers went from 33 to several thousand, and it was a massive, massive undertaking to do this. And since 9/11, the Federal Air Marshals Service, as it's now known, changed its name from program, has had its ups and downs. And although the documentary doesn't go into it, it's quite well known that the inclusion of so many managers from the Secret Service, who were former Secret Service agents, had a detrimental effect, without a doubt. They brought a different culture, which was not it was not conducive to a covert counter-terrorist mission. Also, there was an expansion away from the primary mission into ground-based activities, and again, these could be detrimental in as much as they took skill focus away from the primary mission, and also exposed the guys and girls to having their identities compromised. So it's regarded by quite a few as being something that the FAMs should not have been involved in. And in recent years, things got really bad. And under the Biden presidency, many marshals were taken off flight status and shipped down to the southern border in a non-law enforcement role, handing out food and water to illegal immigrants. And it must have been a real slap in the face to these dedicated professionals to be cast in such a role. All in all, the documentary is a great look at the history and development of the Air Marshals. And I would really appreciate if someone, possibly these producers or someone else, could do a follow-up to include the post 9/11 phase of the story. A lot of it's out there already. Quite a few former Air Marshals have spoken quite openly. So in many ways the secrecy is just bureaucratic, really. And hopefully at some stage we'll get more of the story. But I really enjoyed this, and it's well worth watching.